What's different between men and women? Okay, I know that could be a very big, broad topic that could take us many, many, many weeks. So we'll just be a little bit more specific and say what is different between men and women when it comes to Torah study. Because that's in this week's parasha, and that's what we're going to unpack. And it's going to go a direction that you would expect it to go, and then a direction that you don't expect it to go. So, generically, as far as Torah is concerned, who has more responsibility to study Torah, men or women? Men. Okay, you sound very confident in that view. Men have more responsibility. What does that look like? What does it mean? Are women not obligated to study Torah?
Is it a time-bound?
There we go. Is it a time-bound mitzvah? You see? So is Torah study a time-bound mitzvah? Is there a specific time of the day that you have to study Torah? Because women are exempt from time-bound positive mitzvahs. So if Torah study is a time-bound mitzvah, it's obviously a positive mitzvah, you have to learn Torah. So if it's a time-bound mitzvah, then technically women would be exempt. But is it a time-bound mitzvah? Is there a specific time that you're supposed to learn Torah?
No. I'm not sure.
Not sure, right?
Because when we start off davening in the morning, it's at Shachrit Baravit.
Oh, very good. There's a concept that you're supposed to learn Torah in the morning and you're supposed to learn Torah in the evening. So even though it's not specifically a particular time, you could have the impression that it's a time-bound mitzvah. If it's a time-bound mitzvah, women are exempt. But it turns out actually that there's a whole major discussion whether or not women, forget about the time-bound element, just whether or not women are obligated to study Torah, because they have other obligations that maybe don't allow time often to be able to study Torah. Okay? So there's your first distinction, is whether or not there's an obligation for women to learn Torah. Are there any other distinctions that you could think of between the Torah learning of men and the Torah learning of women? Anything at all that you could think of? Okay, so let me just throw out a few things. It's not common for women to learn Gemara. I'm not saying that women are not permitted to learn Gemara, but it's not common for women to learn Gemara. If you go to a yeshiva, the bulk of the day is Gemara study. If you go to a women's seminary, they might have an elective to learn a little bit of Gemara, or maybe they've got a teacher who specifically likes them to learn Gemara, but it won't be the bulk of the day. So there'd be a distinction in what kind of things men learn versus what kind of things women learn. And let's not only look from a perspective of obligation, why don't we also look from a perspective of processing? What kind of material is more interesting for men? What kind of material is more interesting for women? So if you were preparing a shiur for men, what kind of topics do you think would bring in the crowd? Work-related, business-related, logical, right? That's why men enjoy Gemara, because they like that whole experience of breaking things apart and going, and more than logical, much more importantly, deep or detailed. Details probably thing. Men enjoy the nuance, this opinion says that and the other opinion says this. Exactly what the Gemara does. Very often women get frustrated with that. Why do we have to get it? Let's just, what's the big picture? Just give us the overall view. Just give us the bottom line. That kind of thing. As well as women are naturally inclined to spirituality more than men are. So if you were doing a women's shiur, you have a far greater chance of getting people through the door if it's on a spiritual topic. So you're not going to pack out the hall for a women's shiur if you're going to say we're going to go through the technical laws of how you set up an Eruv, or how you, what happens if this person's ox gored that person's cow. Whereas if you had to say, you're talking about the soul, you're talking about how the spirituality of running a home, those kinds of things. So it's different wiring, it's different priorities, it's different things that tend to attract men and women. Obviously, it's a high generalization, but it's probably valid across most communities. Now, all of that is directly related to a statement in this week's parasha. at first glance, and when you learn the statement in Rashi's commentary, which you'll do, I think it's tomorrow, it might be today or tomorrow's portion. So you're going to see this and you're going to say, okay, it's very simple. It's very straightforward. There's a way of approaching men with Torah. There's a way of approaching women with Torah. But we're not going to focus on Rashi's commentary. Instead, we're going to focus on two different types of midrash that explore this particular concept. One is a midrash called the Mechilta, and one is the possibly better known midrash called the Midrash Rabbah. And they're both going to take this line, and at first glance, they're all going to say the same thing. The two midrashim, you're going to see the Mechilta actually has two opinions. So it sounds like they're all really saying the same thing. And then when you read it in Rashi, it says, oh, he says exactly what the midrash says. Until we start to unpack it. And then we realize that actually not only are they not all saying the same thing, they're actually potentially saying something very different. So here's the verse. Hashem speaks to Moshe, and he's telling Moshe to prepare the Jewish people to receive the Torah at Sinai. So he says, Koi soimar leveis Yaakov, so shall you say to the house of Yaakov, V'saged livnei Yisrael, and you should tell the children of Israel. Now in English, you don't hear a big difference between say and tell. But in Torah language, they are very different expressions. Because the root of the word tomar, which is the word oimer, is a very gentle way of speaking. Generally, throughout the Torah, when Hashem speaks, Vayomer Hashem el Moshe, it's usually a more gentle conversation. Whereas when Hashem says, Vayedaber Hashem el Moshe, it's more likely to be an instruction. So most of the Torah tells us Vayedaber. Hashem told Moshe, instruct the Jewish people X and Y.
Amar.
Same concept. So anytime that you have a variation of the word oimer, it's always a more gentle way of speaking. Koyomar is often a prophecy, and the prophecy is usually to our benefit, so it's a gentle way of speaking. What's much less common is the other word, taged, lehagid. That is a word which could just simply mean narrate, like at the Pesach Seder. Vehigadato levincha, you have to tell your child the story of Pesach. However, it also has an implication of speaking more sternly. And Rashi is the one who picks this up, because Rashi says the word taged is related to the word gid. A gid is a sinew, and sinews are obviously quite tough. So it has this overture of speaking in a tough way, in a stern way. So those are two important distinctions. Koi soimar, now let's look at this Mechilta. The Mechilta is the first midrash that we're going to look at. So the Mechilta says, Koi soimar leveis Yaakov, so should you say to the house of Yaakov. That is how you should speak to the women. V'saged livnei Yisrael, and tell the children of Israel, that is the men. So that's the first thing the Mechilta tells us. Okay? So you speak, that's how you speak to the women, that's how you speak to the men. But then the Midrash, the Mechilta, does something which is a little unusual. It then says, Dovar Acher. Now, you're going to see that in Rashi often, you're going to see that in many other commentators. The expression Dovar Acher usually means, now I'm going to give you another interpretation. And you expect that if you're giving us another interpretation, you're obviously saying something different to what the first interpretation said, right? Is that fair? If I say there's another interpretation, it must be different to the first one. So I'm going to tell you the second one, and you tell me if it sounds different to the first. Okay? So again, the first one was, Koi soimar means the women, and Vesaged means the men. Davar acher, another interpretation is this. Koi soimar, that means that you should speak gently. Beloshon rako, that's the expression, to speak gently. And tell Roshei Dvarim, tell headings to the women. Vesaged, and you should, the other word for tell, Vesaged, you should tell dikdukim, you should tell all the details to the men. Okay? So in the second version of the Mechilta, it's saying that when you speak to the women, speak gently and just give them general principles of Torah. When you speak to the men, be specific and tell them all of the details that they need to know. Does that sound fundamentally different to the first interpretation? First interpretation said, This is how you speak to women. This is how you speak to men. The second interpretation effectively sounds like it's unpacking that and giving us more detail. Okay, so how do you speak to women? Speak to them gently and give them the general principles. How do you speak to men? Be specific and give them every detail. Why is it a davar acher? Why does it sound like it's a whole new opinion? To us, it does not sound like a whole new opinion. Okay, got that? Fine. So that's the Mechilta. Then there's the Medrash Rabbah. The Medrash Rabbah, commenting on the same verse, will sound initially like it's saying pretty much the same thing as, okay, you tell me, as. So the Midrash Rabbah says this, Koi Soimar, this is how you should speak, Leveis Yaakov, to the house of Yaakov. So the Midrash Rabbah says, what that means is that you should speak Roshei Dvarim, the headings, to the women, because that's what they are able to appreciate. Okay? Then it says, V'saged livnei Yisrael, and you should tell the children of Israel. That is all the detail and the punishments. That's what you should tell to the men, because that's what they will appreciate hearing. Doesn't sound fundamentally different to what we've just learned in the Mechilta. And the truth is, you can pick up nuanced differences. For example, the Midrash Rabbah does not say speak gently. It just says tell them the general principles. And the Midrash Rabbah makes this note of effectively tell them what they would appreciate hearing, which the Mechilta didn't. Okay? So that would seem to be the distinction here. And at first glance, the easiest way to try and explain this is we don't yet know why the Mechilta has two opinions which really sound the same, but at first glance, it sounds like the Midrash Rabbah is effectively telling us very similar information to the Mechilta. And the sum total of it all is, when you speak to women, keep it soft and keep it general. When you speak to men, that's when you can really throw the book at them with all of its details and consequences. And if you examine Rashi's interpretation, Rashi will pretty much seem to say the same thing. Okay? It's pretty much how it's going to be. So the first thing we've got to try to understand is, why are there two views in the Mechilta, even though they seem to be saying the identical thing? And what we're going to notice, and this will start our conversation, because all of this was essentially just introducing our conversation. Now we can start our conversation. So what we've got to really work out over here, and you'll pick it up in the words, is what are we describing? We understand. It's Hashem telling Moshe how to teach the Jews. We get that. And when you teach the Jews, anticipate that there are two processes that you have to follow. One process is gentle and general, and the other process is stern and detailed. Right? That's across the board of all of the interpretations, right? One approach is tell them softly, nicely, don't get into too much, just give them the headings. The other approach is tell them exactly like it is, with all of the detail and all of the consequences. The question is, why would there be two processes? So let's think about it for a second. Why would there be two processes? What's the first thing that comes to your mind? Why Moshe would have two ways of teaching Torah? Huh?
Well,
Okay.
Intellectual and emotional appeal.
There's no emotion over here. We're not talking from an emotional perspective. This is teaching. It's teaching Torah.
And dare you say that women are less intellectual? You could say
Right? So,
Women will ask more questions.
okay. So if women are going to ask more questions,
Yes,
they
I
should
was
get more
gonna say.
detail.
No, but would they not, what's the right word? Talk against it. Say, why are you telling me this? I don't want to know this.
I don't know.
Be more aggressive.
If you think that it's safe to say that.
Can say whatever you
Yeah,
like.
we
Men
can
and women
say
are from
every
different
word.
planets. You got to use two different. methods.
Okay, good. So there's the first possibility. You are talking to completely different audiences. And men and women process in very different ways. So therefore it would make sense that the way you speak to men and the way that you speak to women is not going to be the same.
I thought we covered
That-
that part in the beginning.
Well, that's the easiest way to explain this, right? So, the first view in the Mechilta said this: Koi soimar. Now we know that soimar means to speak gently, and we also know that it means just to give the headings instead of all of the details. That is how you speak to women. That's all the first opinion said. That is how you speak to women. And tagaid, which is to be very detailed and very specific, that is how you speak to men. In other words, that opinion in the Mechilta is saying it's all about your audience. So depending who you're talking to, that will determine how you talk. And then that's highlighting the difference between the processing of men and the processing of women. Okay? That's an easy interpretation. But the second view in the Mechilta would be saying, this has nothing to do with your audience. This has nothing to do with who you're speaking to. That's why in the second version of the Mechilta, it doesn't say, these are the women and you should tell them gently and generally. It says the reverse. It says, you should speak gently and you should speak generally to the women. So it doesn't start off by telling you the audience. It starts off by telling you the process. Now this actually makes a lot of sense, because when you teach any person, any subject, it always makes sense that first you teach them the general principles. And then you start to unpack those principles. That's just logical. That's the best way to share information. So for example,
then where do you get the distinction between a female audience and a male audience?
again, the first opinion in the Mechilta says it's all about the difference between the audience. So the reason Moshe is speaking to this group this way and to that group that way is because of the nature of the groups. But according to the second opinion in the Mechilta, the distinction is not because of who the group is, it's a distinction in how any teaching process should work. So for example, you're going to tell somebody there's something called Shabbos. Shabbos is that on the seventh day you rest. That's the general principle. Now I have to tell you what rest looks like, because some people think that rest is that you just kick off your shoes and sit by the pool the whole day. So I've got to explain to you, no, rest looks like this. You may not do 39 different categories of work. That's actually what rest is. But if I haven't first taught you the principle that there's an idea of resting on Shabbos, it would be a little ridiculous for me to say, now listen, when Saturday rolls around, you can't turn on the stove and you can't flip the light switch and you can't drive your car. It wouldn't make sense. I don't have context. So the second view in the Mechilta says this is not really about an audience. This is about a process. And in that process, first you deal with the general stuff and then you get into the details. Okay? Now that would seem to make a lot of sense.
It does work actually if you reverse engineer it. You experience it first.
Experience is something else. We're not talking about experience.
But you could do the detail, and then when a person gets that, then you can say, now you get to the general principle, which is...
Yeah, but why would you teach that way? Imagine you stand in front of your class and you're going to start teaching them detailed fractions before you've taught them the principle that there's a concept of a fraction. It wouldn't make sense, right? You can't. I mean, you can reverse engineer an experience, but to teach from the detail to the general doesn't really work. The best way to teach is you first say, here's the principle, now let me explain the principle to you. So these are the two perspectives that we've got over here. We've got two ways of how Torah should be taught. The one is that you've got to look at your audience and then, of course, play to your audience. And the other is you have to look at your process and determine the best process to use in order to successfully teach. So that's really essentially where you've got these two views in the Mechilta. Now let's look at the Midrash Rabbah. What did the Midrash Rabbah say? Did the Midrash Rabbah say that it's about the audience? Or did the Midrash Rabbah say that it's about the process? Well, we're going to have to reread the Midrash Rabbah to remember what it said, to try and identify which one it's going with. So the Midrash Rabbah said this. I'll just repeat the words, listen to those words and see if it's talking audience or if it's talking process. Okay, so the Midrash Rabbah said this. It said, Koi soimar leveis Yaakov. This is how you should speak to the house of Yaakov. To tell them Roshei Dvarim, general principles to the women because that's what they would appreciate hearing. V'sagei livnei Yaakov, and then you should get all the detail which you give to the children of Yaakov. That is that you should get into the dikdukim, the details, and even the consequences. That's what you tell the men because that's what they would appreciate hearing. So, is the Midrash Rabbah talking about audience or is it talking about process?
Well, both, but it mentions process first and then audience, no?
Okay, I don't know. Can't be both. It's got to be one.
Well, process leads.
Process? Right? Why would you say process?
Because of how you worded it.
Okay, so how did it word?
You started with, you should teach in this general manner, and
Right.
then you mentioned the audience secondary. So to me,
Correct.
it's process.
Correct, but the difference is the Midrash explained what the audience needs, which the Mechilta did not even do. The Midrash says what they would appreciate hearing. If I'm talking just about the process that I use, then I won't say because that's what the audience needs. I'd say because that's the best means of teaching. The fact that the Midrash uses this expression, that's what the audience would appreciate, right? Speak in this way to the women because that's what they would appreciate. Speak that way in the men because that's what they would appreciate. That actually tells you that that's talking about the audience. Okay? So therefore we're going to use the Midrash Rabbah, which is talking about the audience, and we're going to compare it because now the Midrash Rabbah is effectively saying the same thing as the first view in the Mechilta. So we're going to use the Midrash Rabbah, which is saying how you define and therefore address your audience, and compare that to the Mechilta, which is saying how you define your process. And we're going to ask ourselves the obvious question, why would you choose each of those approaches? In other words, the Torah is telling us how Moshe has to speak to two different groups. That's clear. But the question is the emphasis on who the groups are, or is the emphasis on what the process of teaching should be? This is what we want to unpack. And this is not to say one is more important than the other, but rather to say, what do we learn from each one? If I believe that the Torah wants us to know that you have to speak differently to women to how you speak to men, then we need to know what's the lesson in that. And if the Torah wants us to know that the way to teach is you first start with general ideas and then you get into the details, we want to know what's the lesson in that. And so all of this is going to hinge on one concept that is shared in both the Midrash and the Mechilta. And whenever you have the same concept shared in two places, you just naturally assume they're saying the same thing. So the first thing we're going to interpret is they're using the same words, they're not saying the same thing. What are the words that they're using? Roshei Dvarim. Roshei Dvarim means headings. So both the Midrash Rabbah, who says, tell the women the headings because that's what they appreciate hearing, and the Mechilta, who says, when you speak to the women, speak gently and tell them the headings, they're both using the word Roshei Dvarim. They don't mean the same thing at all. The word headings in the Mechilta and the word headings in Midrash Rabbah are totally different uses of headings. Once we discover what that difference is, then we'll have the key to knowing what is the difference if I'm focused on the audience, or specifically the men and women as audiences, versus if I'm focused on the process, what's the ideal way to teach Torah. Okay? So everything's going to hinge on our understanding of what Roshei Devarim are. What are headings? So you could think, between now and tomorrow, if I say I'm going to give you the headings, the headlines, what am I actually trying to share with you? So you can think about that and we'll pick it up tomorrow.